Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Lam Yitz Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Kuf Samach Zayin Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch on Kuf Samach Vav Amid Beis, Siman Shin Chav Ches Sif Chav Tes. My apologies for the fact that today's share is going to be audio only. It's unfortunately due to circumstances. That is what I can do today. Our learning should be aschus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanasuna Batzar Bashivya Haim de Ben Bayam Ben Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihim Veitzia Mitzar Lervacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibud Leguula Hashtabagalo V'Zman Kariv and Amar Amen. Our learning should be aschus Refuah Shalema for Gila Shifra Bas Ilana Udal Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shiraleach, Havadasa bas Serel. They should have a refuah shalema b'sar shar Chayle Yisrael. We're mispalled to the Rebbeinu Shalom that in the schus of the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. So here in Siman Shin Chav Ches, we've been learning the halachas of a choyle on Shabbos, somebody who's suffering from some kind of an ailment on Shabbos. What are you allowed to do on their behalf? What are you not allowed to do on their behalf? What are they allowed to do, etc., etc.? We continue on the same theme here in Sif Chav Tes. Says the Mechaber, Mi shenikfa yadai oiragloi, somebody who bangs his hand, his foot, and now there's a concern for swelling. So we know, for example, somebody falls down and lightly sprains his ankle. One of the concerns right away is there's going to be swelling. Swelling creates pain. Swelling also makes, sometimes it takes longer for the injury to heal. So right away, a very quick concern is to minimize and ease swelling. So the Mechaber says, Mi shenikva yada iragla, if somebody bangs his hand or his foot, tzaimsa b'yayin. You could apply wine, soak it in wine. The word samsa means to retract or there's a word that I'm looking for. It's escaping me. Not to shrivel. To somehow the only English word that's coming to me right now, even though it's not the one I'm looking for, is to contract. You could apply wine kidei lahamid hadam, in order to restrain the dam. What causes swelling? Well, one of the things that causes swelling is that when there's an injury, the body immediately sends all sorts of fluids to the injury site. You want a buildup of white blood cells, lymph nodes go into action. So there's a lot of fluid that comes to the injury site, and that is what eventually blows up into a swelling situation. So over here, you want to use this yayin kidei laha'amid hadam to prevent the buildup of the dam and to prevent the swelling. So the Mechaber said you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to use yayin. Avaloi b'chaimitz, but you're not allowed to do this with vinegar, mipnei shehu chazak, because vinegar is very strong, v'yesh bai mishum refuah, and that is going to have a distinct therapeutic effect, and that is going to be asur because of shchikas samanim. V'imhu ma'unig, and if he's a very delicate person, and very sensitive person, then af hayayin loi kamei hachaimitz, then yayin is going to have the same therapeutic effect for him that chaimitz would have for ordinary people, and therefore it's kamei hachaimitz va'asur, and it would be asur. Says the Mishnah Berurah on the bottom of Kuf Samach Vav Amud Beis, Mishnah Berurah is cut in Tzadik Aleph. Shenigfa. What does shenigfa mean? Shenichshala v'laksa. He stumbled and he got injured. Umayri, and we're discussing here a case, Shaloi Haya al Yidei Barzel. This is not an injury that was caused by something metallic. V'gam shaloi nikfu hayad v'haregel al gaban. And we're also not discussing a case where the hand or the foot were injured on the top of the hand or on the top of the foot. Why is the Mishnah Berurah saying this? The ilu nikfu al gaban, because if we're talking about an injury that's on the top of the foot or on the top of the hand, or we're talking about an injury that was caused by something metallic, we already learned in Seifim Vav and Zayin, those would be injuries that we consider to be a sakana, and you would be mechal Shabbos for those types of injuries. So the Mechaber said that you could use wine to reduce the swelling. I think that's the word that I was struggling so hard to recall. Reduce. You want to reduce the swelling. So you could use wine. However, you cannot use vinegar. Certainly you cannot use any kind of liquor or schnapps. If we're talking about a person who is mu'unag, what does that mean? That he's delicate and sensitive. Sha'ar b'sarei rach. It means that his skin is very fair and soft. And then anything that has strength, like vinegar, kasha libisarei v'tzaimes umerape. It is something that is kasha libisarei. It's something that will have a distinct effect on his skin, and it will automatically reduce the swelling, umarape, and it will have a therapeutic effect, and therefore it is aser. Moving along to Sif Lamed, second line down, Kuf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber, Mi shenishpata perek yadoi or ragloi mimekaimoi. Somebody who has a dislocated joint. So a joint of his hand or arm or his foot or his leg slipped out mimekaimoi. It became dislocated. Lo yishav shefena harbe b'tzoinen. You should not rub the limb excessively with something cold. Shezeu refuasai, because that is the refuah for such a condition. And that would be something which would be aser gzeru mishum shchikas samanim. Ela rather roichitz kedarkoi. What you could do is you could wash the limb. So don't be doing something that is muchacha milsa, that what you're doing is an act that is therapeutic. Instead, do it in a way that is washing. V'im nisrape nisrape. And if it has the desired therapeutic effect, so be it. So in other words, what we're answering over here is, we don't want you to do the yeshav shefena harbe b'tzainen. We don't want you to do the act which is considered the refuah for such a condition. Because that's a muchachabil, so that you're doing something for refuah. That's aser gzerim mishum shchikas samanim. But you want to go ahead and you want to wash the limb, and it happens to be that you're using something cold, and it happens to be that during the washing you're rubbing the limb, and now the therapeutic effect will take place, that's fine. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is very short over here. Mishnah Berurah's cut in Tzadik Dalet says, Misha nishpata, what does this mean? It means that the bone became dislocated from the joint. And he brings this down from a Rashi. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, we have to look weiter in this Siman, in Sif Mem Zayin, over there the Mishnah Berurah is going to be very concerned with what seems to be an outright stira, because over here, the Mechaber mentions a dislocated limb, and he says you're not allowed to do what would typically be the therapeutic act. And yet, in Sif Mem Zayin, the Mechaber says straight out, Etzem sheyotza mimekoimai, a bone that became dislocated, machzirin oisai. You're allowed to go pop it back into place. So we're going to have to balance out these two sifim, and that's something that the Mishnah Berurah will discuss later on in Sif Mem Zayin. I should just mention, I think it's worth mentioning at this point, that when dealing with sprains, when dealing with broken limbs, especially a broken foot, a broken lower leg, that definitely could be a sakana, for certain a sakanas aver, but not just a sakanas aver. You have instances, chas v'chalila, where blood vessels get trapped. It could be mamish, an outright sakana. So we would usually treat those kinds of things as a chayla sheyesh by sakana. Of course, if it's feasible and practicable to ask a shaila when something happens, remember what we learned, that when there is a sakana, somebody who asks a shaila is considered to be a shayfech damim. He's a ritzeach. When we're dealing with a chayla sheyesh by sakana, it's not the time to go ask shailas. But when we're dealing with something where it's very reasonable to think that this is not a sakana, But you want to know, maybe halachically it is considered a sakana, it would be appropriate to ask a shayla. Usually in Yiddish communities, when you're dealing with Hatzalah, etc., they have the answers to those questions. Okay, moving along 3 lines down, Kuf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber in Sif Lamed Aleph, Tzipiren Shepersha, a nail, a fingernail that becomes separated. Vitzitzin, or strips of skin, Shehein Kimin Ritzuos, these are like little straps or little strings of skin, Dakois, that are very small, Shepershu me Arha Etzba Saviv Atzipiren, that becomes separated from the skin that surrounds the fingernail. This is what we call in English a hangnail. You get from the dry skin around the nail, you get a strip that peels off. And we all know that those hangnails could become very, very painful. So the Mechaber says, let's just paraphrase here, the Mechaber says, if you have a nail, a fingernail, or you have a hangnail, are you allowed to remove it on Shabbos or not? So says the Mechaber, it depends. In Pershu Ruban, if they have become roiv, separated from the body. And by the hangnails, the next words, according to the Rishonim, apply to the hangnail, not to the nail. And it is klape maila. The hangnail is hanging towards, it's hanging upwards. Now we're going to see that there's a machlekes what that means. And this fingernail or this hangnail is causing pain. So then, lasiran biyad, to remove the fingernail or the hangnail using your hand, to peel it off with your hand, is mutter. It's outright mutter. The kli, to cut off the nail or the hangnail with some kind of an instrument, pater, aval aser, that would be an issa d'Rabbanan. So let's pause here for a second. So what's the first halacha that the Mechaber is telling us here in Sif Lamed Aleph? You have a fingernail. Let's start with the fingernail. Now, when a fingernail separates, we could measure very easily, is the hanging piece of nail, is it separated by the majority? Is it roiv? Is it persha ruban? Is it mostly separated from the body? Or is it not? Well, the fingernail has a distinct length. When a piece of the fingernail is hanging, you could look at the hanging piece and you could say, is the majority of it still connected to the nail? Or is this a piece that peeled off almost, let's say, to the end of the fingernail? Or it's peeled off more than 50% across the width of the nail? So most of it is hanging. So that would be the case of Pirshu Ruban. Most of it is already separated. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us from the Rishonim that when something is most of the way separated, we look at it as if it's already separated. Now, let's realize, when you separate a fingernail from the body, what Isser Shabbos does that entail? The answer is, it's the Isser Malacha of Goizes. There's an Isser Malacha, the Goizes 101 is going and shearing wool off a sheep. So you're taking something that grows on the body and you're cutting it off. To cut off a fingernail is the same thing. It's the Av Malach of Goizes. Your fingernails grow on your body. They're attached to your body. If you separate it from the body, it's the Av Malach of Daraisa, of Goizes. However, if the nail is already the majority of the way separated, then we look at it as if it's already detached. Now to separate it would not be an Issa Daraisa, because we don't call that Goizes. We don't consider it that you're cutting something off. It's something that's already detached, but it is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, with that understanding, let's see what the Mechaber said. The Mechaber said, you have this hanging fingernail. If it's hanging most of the way, well, then it's already considered detached. If it's already considered detached, there can't be an Issa D'Raisa. It's not an Issa D'Raisa of Goizes. All that's left is an Issa D'Rabbanan. It is also a D'Rabbanan. But, says the Mechaber, if you do it biyad, if you break it off with your hand, the Mechaber said it's mutter. It's not even Issa D'Rabbanan. Why? Because it's an Issa D'Rabbanan to remove it. You're doing it with a shinui, because peeling it off with your hand is not the normal way to remove a fingernail. The normal way is to use a nail clipper or to use a scissor. You're peeling it off with your hand. That's considered a shinui. And it's a case where it's causing you tsar. So we have a lot of mitigating factors over here. It's not an issa d'oraisa of geizes because it's mostly detached. You're doing it with a shinui. So you're doing an issa d'rabanan with a shinui. And it's b'mokum tsar. It's causing you pain. In that case, says the mechaber, it's mutter. But to do it with a keli, to do it with an implement, the mechaber said is an issa d'rabanan. Why? Because even though the nail is most of the way separated, still cutting it off is an issa d'rabanan. And if you do it with an implement, you're not doing it with a shinui. Since you're not doing it with a shinui, even though it's causing tsar, it's still an issa d'rabanan. Now, the mechaber also addressed the question of a hangnail. Now, a hangnail is a little bit more complicated. Why? Because by the hangnail, the mechaber says that the only time it's mutter to do it, to take it off, even biyad, is if it is hanging klape maila. It has to be hanging in the upward direction. And at the end of the sif, the mechaber is going to bring down a machlokes rishonim what's called klape maila. And we have a suffix of what's called klape maila. And therefore, we can't check off this checkbox. We never know if a hangnail is considered klape maila or not, and therefore the Mishnah Berurah is going to come out that it is never permissible to remove a hangnail. Not if you do it biyad, not if you do it with a keli. But let's do some of the Mishnah Berurah, and let's go on with the rest of this sif. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton tzaddik. Hey. In Dirshu Ruban, if most of the fingernail or most of the hangnail has become separated. Now, the Mishnah Berurah speaks out one thing that I told you. Bitzipirin, when it comes to a fingernail, it's very easy to determine if it's mostly separated or not. Hainu roiv tzipirin. Okay, go across the majority of the nail. The piece that's hanging, is it peeled off the majority of the nail? If it's peeled off the majority of the nail, that's roiv. Ubatzitzin, but when it comes to hangnails, how do you measure what's considered roiv by a hangnail? I don't know how to measure roiv when it comes to a hangnail. A hangnail is a piece of skin, and it is connected to all of the skin on your body. So how do you measure roiv? What? It has to be separated from most of the skin of your body? So if it's peeling off the tip of your finger, it has to be peeling down your arm, down your torso, down your leg to your toes, or at least past the 50% mark? Well, what's considered roiv? The Pri Megadim says, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what's considered roiv. The efsher, he says, possibly it means he says, really, the hangnail also has a specific size. I mean, I'm looking at my thumb right now. If you look at the middle of your thumb, that's not hangnail territory. Hangnail territory is along the side of the fingernail. That's hangnail territory. So if it's peeled off most of the way down the side of the fingernail, that's usually where hangnails get peeled off. So if it's a roiv of that, it would be considered the majority. Ois cotton tzadik vav, so the mechaber said, if most of it is already peeled off, then lahasiran biyad mutter, that to peel it off using your hand is 100% mutter. Why? The kevin shepershu ruban, because once most of it is already separated, kroivin linotek, it is very close to coming off, v'ketlushin damya, and therefore halachically we look at it as if it's already separated. Hilkach, therefore, b'makom tsara, when we're dealing in a case where it's causing tsar, loy gazur rabbanan, the Chazal did not make an iser, kishuhu misiray al yedei shinoi dahainu biyadoi, when he's peeling it off with his hand, which constitutes a shinoi, and it's causing him tsar. So again, I did the math over here. The math is very simple. Since most of it is already separated, to peel it off the rest of the way is only an issa d'rabanan. You're doing it biyad, which constitutes a shinui, so you're doing an issa d'rabanan with a shinui, and we allow you to do that b'makom tsar. The Mishnah Berurah throws in another caveat: v'tzarich lizar shelo yotzi dam. We have to take care not to cause bleeding, because to cause bleeding would be a terlada of netilas neshama. Ois cotton tzadik zayin loy pershu ruban. Oh, we have to go weiter in the mechaber now. Now, says the mechaber, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down the middle of the line, loy pershu ruban. Let's say the fingernail or the hangnail is not most of the way separated. Then biyad potter avaloser, to peel it off with your hand would be an issa d'Rabbanan. It's not an issa d'Oraisa because it's no longer goizes. So it's not going to be an issa d'Oraisa. I'm sorry. I misspoke. Biyad, if it's not most of the way separated, bayad, to peel it off with your hand, is potter avaloser, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Why is it an issa d'Rabbanan? Because yes, it is goizes, but you're doing it with a shinoi, because you're doing it bayad. Since you're doing it with a shinoi, it's downgraded to an issa d'Rabbanan. Bekli, but to cut it off with an implement, chayev chatos, would be an issa d'Oraisa of goizes, because it's not most of the way separated. So now to cut it off is mamish goizes d'Oraisa. Let's pause here. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's cut in Tzadik Zayin, loy pershu ruban, if it's not most of the way separated. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hu adin da'afilu loy pershu klal, even if you're talking about something that is not separated from the body at all, you just cut off a piece of skin. Potter biyad, it would be an issa d'Rabbanan if you peel off a piece of skin biyad, dein derech l'tloish biyad, because that's doing something with the shinoi. V'nakte, so why did the Mechaber say loy pershu ruban? Lashmi'inan da'afilu bazeh aser, to just let you know that even over here, it's something that is going to be an issa d'Rabbanan if you do it biyad, and an issa d'Oraisa if you do it with a keli. If you do it with a keli, it's an issa d'Oraisa to terlada de goizes, because it's goizes. V'ayin l'kaban b'simin shin mem b'biur halacha. Going weiter in the Mechaber, 6 lines down, says the Mechaber. We mentioned over here, the Mechaber said that by the hangnail, the only time it's going to be mutter to remove it, even if it's most of the way separated, the only time it's going to be mutter to separate it is if it is peeling off klape maila. It's going upwards. Now, what does upwards mean? Upirish Rashi klape maila. Rashi explains that klape maila means klape roshe etzba'osav. The hangnail is peeling upwards towards the fingertip. So the hangnail began to separate from the body further along. Further along down the finger, and it is peeling upwards towards the fingertip. Rashi says that that's what klape maila means, and that's when it could potentially be mutter. Rabbeinu Tam perish, but Taisus argues. Rabbeinu Tam says, Dahainu klape haguf, that klape maila means just the opposite. It started peeling off towards the fingertip, and it's peeling downward towards the body. And the Mechaber says, since we have this major machlokes, Rashi and the Rabbeinu Tam, we have to be concerned for both. And since we have to be concerned for both, we don't know what klape maila means by a hangnail. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eiskad Tzadik Tes, Lishnei Pirushim, we have to be chayshish both for Rashi and the Rabbeinu Tam, v'lachein. And therefore, since we cannot check off the checkbox of klape maila, right? In order for it to be mutter to peel off a hangnail, there's a couple of check boxes. First of all, it has to be peeling off klape maila. Second of all, it has to be pershu ruban, right? And it has to be causing tsar. So pershu ruban, the Pri Megadim told us, he's very mesupik, what pershu ruban means. Maybe it means the hangnail territory, where it's normal for something to peel off. But now we have another suffix. We don't know what klape maila means. Does klape maila mean that it began to peel off at the fingertip and it's going down, like Rashi, or does it mean like the Rabbeinu Tam that it began to peel off further down the finger and it's peeling upwards? We don't know. Says the Mechaber, we have to be chayshish for both, and therefore, afilu pershu ruban, even if you could somehow decide that the hangnail is a roiv of the way separated, also litlan, you're still not allowed to take it off, afilu biyad, even if you do it with your hand, because we don't know what klape maila means. Turning to Sif Lamed Beis, this is a Sif that is very often negeya. Says the Mechaber, HaChoshish B'Shinav, somebody who has a toothache. Now, the words HaChoshish B'Shinav, the Mishnah Berurah takes this to mean that this is a Mechush Ba'alma. This is a relatively garden variety, moderate toothache. This is certainly not a toothache that is a chayli kol aguf. This is not a toothache that is ka'iv le tuva, that's causing a tremendous amount of pain. This is not a toothache that we spoke about earlier in the Siman, where we said that there are toothaches that are considered a makas cholol, that could be a sakonis nefashos. This is a very much a garden variety toothache. Therefore, says the Mechaber, lo yigma behem chometz v'yifloit. You cannot fill your mouth with vinegar, rinse your mouth with vinegar, and then spit the vinegar out, because that is considered something that is mucha chamilsa, that you're doing it for refuah. And since we're talking about a mechush ba'alma, you're not allowed to do anything that's mucha chamilsa, that you're doing it for refuah. Aval, however, what you could do is migameya. You could fill up your mouth with chometz ubaleya, and you could swallow it. So you could take a drink of vinegar. You want to get the vinegar into your mouth so that it should hit your teeth and it should ease your toothache. All right, take a big drink of vinegar, fill up your mouth with vinegar, and swallow it. Or alternately, mitabel boy. Use the vinegar as a salad dressing. So go take some lettuce and dunk it into vinegar, and eat vinegar eat lettuce dunked into vinegar. So you'll get the vinegar on your teeth. Similarly, says the Mechaber, hachoshish begroinoi, somebody who has a sore throat. Lo ya'arenu b'shemen, you cannot gargle with oil. Somehow that was known to be a refuah. Again, you're doing something that's muchamilsa for refuah. Aval, however, what you could do is, you want to take a drink of oil, go ahead, take a drink of oil. Vim nisrape, and if it eases your sore throat, so be it, because you're not doing something that is muchamilsa for refuah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and kuf. Of somebody who has a toothache. For somebody who has this mechush ba'alma, a simple toothache, you're not allowed to ask any Yehudi to do anything for refuah for this person. You're not even allowed to do a shvus to shvus. So you're not even allowed to do a mira la'akum on an issa d'rabanan for this person who has a garden variety toothache. Because this is not a serious concern. It's just a mechush ba'alma. However, but if he's really suffering from the pain, and now it's becoming a chayla kol gufay, it's affecting his whole body. He's weakened, he's in a weakened state, in a weakened condition, because he's suffering terribly. Remember what we learned at Sif Gimel. If you have somebody who's chayla kol gufay, you're allowed to do amir la'akum even on an issa daraisa. Va'ayin Sham B'Hagah, and he also tells us to take a look at the Ramah in Sif Gimel, who spoke about asking an Ein Yehudi to extract a tooth on Shabbos. Ayin Sham in the Ramah and in the Mishnah Berurah. Kuf Aleph, so the Mechaber said, this person who has a mechush ba'alma on his teeth, lo yigma, he cannot rinse his mouth with vinegar. Why? Because he's doing something which is very clearly for refuah purposes. It's aser gzeri mishum shchikas samonim. Va'afilu lishais v'achakach yivla aser. And even to go take the vinegar into your mouth and rinse your mouth with it and then swallow it is also aser, because that's also muchamilsa. That is for refuah. What would be mutter? Just to take an ordinary drink of vinegar. So you could fill up your mouth with vinegar. You could take a big gulp so it fills up your mouth nicely, but you could take a big gulp of vinegar and swallow it down. But you can't fill up your mouth with vinegar, rinse, and then swallow. That's muchamilsa, that you're doing something that is for refuah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Kuf Beis, Bahem Chometz. You can't do this with vinegar. V'huadin yayin saraf. A lot of people do this. They use schnapps. You take a good strong scotch or a good strong bourbon, and you rinse your mouth with it, and it has a therapeutic effect on the toothache. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you wouldn't be allowed to do that on Shabbos either. V'huadin yayin saraf gam ken dinin kamei chometz. However, b'makom tsar gadol, if somebody is suffering greatly from a toothache, efshar lismach b'yayin saraf, it could be that we could be makel when it comes to schnapps. The mutal hashoyse b'fiv, that you're allowed to, keep the scotch in your mouth for a little while, v'levloya achakach, and then to go down and swallow it. Now, if you do the math over here, the Mishnah Berurah says that this person has tsar gadol. Now, if it's tsar gadol and he's a choyle kol haguf from that, well, we learned that the halacha is that when you have a chayla she'ein by sakana, and it's a chayli kalaguf, you're definitely allowed to ask an Eina Yehudi to do Isurei D'Rabbanan. As far as the Yisrael doing an Isurei D'Rabbanan, straight out, we paskind like the Shitas HaRamban, that a Yisrael is allowed to do an Isurei D'Rabbanan with a Shinui. Now, it could be that that's what the Chai Yodim means here. I didn't see the Chai Yodim inside, but reading from the Mishnah Berurah, I'm wondering if that's what the Chai Yodim means. Over here, we're dealing with an Isurei D'Rabbanan. The whole reason this is aser is with Gzeira Mishum Shchikas Samonim. Now, to use Yayin Saraf, to use schnapps, that's already a mitigating factor. Because you're not using a medicine, you're using schnapps. So somebody sees you take a shot glass of good scotch and pour it into your mouth, right now it's definitely not Mucha Chamilsa that what you're doing is for refuah. What's the shaila? You want to know, can I retain it in my mouth for a while and swish it around my mouth before I swallow it? Maybe that's Mucha Milsa that is for refuah. Well, first of all, I don't know if that's really Mucha Milsa that's for refuah. Maybe you're swishing it around your mouth because you want to get the full taste of the schnapps. And also, there's another mitigating factor, which is you're going to swallow it. Maybe at worst, that would be considered doing something for refuah with a shinui, which definitely would be mutter. And now we come to the next piece of the Mishnah Berurah. Oid Kosav, the Chai Adam also writes, you wouldn't be allowed to take cloves and put them over the tooth. Oy spirits, you wouldn't be allowed to use something like alcohol, visubin chamin, or make a hot compress out of bran that was heated up. You can't do any of those things because they're muchamilsa, that they're for refuah. So they're also in Rabbanon Gzer Mishum Shchikas Samonim. Imloi dekav leituva, unless it's causing a considerable amount of pain. Shemitztara kol gufai, and now you consider the chaylik kol guf. Ukidaleil b'sif yod zayin. In that case, then you're definitely allowed to do an Isurei D'Rabbanan with a shinoi. V'ayin shom le'el al yidei Yisrael mutar dafka al yidei shinoi. And now we come to a very important line in the Mishnah Berurah. Hachayodam masik sham, a very important chayodam. The im efshar b'shinoi, if there's something that is impossible to do al yidei shinoi, mutar shaloi b'shinoi. Very important chayodam, Rabbi say. When it comes to somebody who's a chayla, she'ein boi sakana, but it's koyev leituva, he's suffering significantly, and he's a chayli kalaguf, we paskin like the Ramban, that Yisrael is allowed to do an Isurei D'Rabbanan al yidei shinoi. But if it's something that cannot be done al yidei shinoi, you're allowed to do it without a shinoi. So if you ask me, halacha l'maisa, somebody has a terrible toothache on Shabbos, and it's to the extent where he's suffering that it's already a chayli kalaguf, could he go ahead and could he go swish with scotch? I think he can. Can he swish with Listerine? Well, Listerine is already not muchamilsa for refuah, right? It's like schnapps. It's not like chaimitz. Chaimitz is muchamilsa that you're doing it for refuah because people don't normally rinse their mouths with vinegar. But Listerine, people rinse their mouths with Listerine every morning. So it's not muchamilsa that is for refuah. Even if you retain it in your mouth, it's not muchamilsa that you're doing it for refuah. Maybe you're doing it because of bad breath. And you're doing it for social purposes, not for refuah. That's not called refuah. So that wouldn't even be a shaila, l'chayra. There's no muchamilsa for refuah over there at all. Gzerim b'shuv shchikas samonim? What kind of gzerim b'shuv shchikas samonim? By schnapps, when you're retaining it in your mouth, at least I could see the room for a gzera. But if it's kav leituva and he's a chaylik kalaguf, there's no real way to do it al yidei shinoi. It would be mutter even shalai al yidei shinoi. Ois cotton kuv gimel, the Mechaber said that somebody who has a sore throat cannot gargle with oil. Pirish, what does this mean? What does this word yar'enu mean? Pirish sheyasha Hashem in befiv. He retains the oil in his mouth, in his throat. Even if he's going to swallow it at the end, it's still problematic. The certainly, if he spits it back out, it is muchamilsa that what he was doing for refuah purposes. Even to take the oil and add it to beet juice, which created the drink that they knew as a nigroin, it is still usher to go do this if you're going to retain it in your mouth, because that is so that you're doing it for a fuah. There are those that answer this. This is totally dependent on time and place. If it's not normal for healthy people to drink oil in that locale and at that time, then it's also Sif Lamed Zayin. Turning to Sif Lamed Gimel, says the Mechaber, Goyneyach, somebody who is groaning. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says that this is referring to a very specific type of illness. This is brought down from a Gemara in Ksubis and Daf Samach. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Kovav, Goyneyach. Who is this Goyneyach? Mike'ev Liboy. This is some kind of a heartache. And the known refuah for this was to suckle warm milk directly from the animal. Okay, now, backdrop. What is the isser? What isser is involved in extracting milk from an animal? That would be the isser deraisa of mefarek. You're extracting something edible from inside its enclosure. So it's like you're mefarek, you extract the grain from the husks. Over here, you're extracting the milk from the animal. That would be the isser deraisa of mefarek. Now, over here, you're dealing with a goyneyach. So you're dealing with somebody who has an ailment. He is ill to some extent. And what does he want to do? He wants to suckle the milk from the behemoth. Now that is mefarek with a shinui. It is not the normal suckling milk from an animal. For a human being to suckle milk from an animal is not the normal way that human beings extract the milk from animals. They usually milk the animals. So to suckle the milk from the animal would be mefarek with a shinui, which would downgrade it to an issa d'Rabbanan. Therefore, says the Mechaber, Goyneyach, this Goyneyach, mutter linoik chalav behabehema. It is mutter for him to suckle the milk straight out of the animal. The b'makom tzaira lo gazer Rabbanan. Since he's suffering, b'makom tsar, the Chachamim did not enforce their gezerah against doing an issa daraisa with a shinui. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Kovav. We did that. Goyneyach mekav liboy shefuas lina chalav reisech behabehema. Ois Katan Kovzayin de b'makom tsara. Hainu dav te ikar chalivas habehema hu midaraisa mishum mefarek. Even though extracting milk from an animal is an issa daraisa mefarek, du told the dash ukamay shekasav de bereish siman shenchaf. Nevertheless, pazeh in this case shual yedayanika, where he's extracting the milk by suckling it. Duhu rak kelachar yad. That's a shinui. Lo you have a rak issa b'drabanan. It's only an issa d'Rabbanan v'yitiru bazeh, and they were matter it because of the tsar. V'after karbala de b'chal chayli she'em b'sakana omer le'ini Yehudi v'oisa. Normally, if you do the math, we're dealing with a chayla she'en b'sakana. So we say, if it's a chayla she'en b'sakana, you want to do an issa d'Rabbanan, ask an Eini Yehudi to do the issa d'Rabbanan. Or at least do the issa d'Rabbanan with a shinui. Says the Mishnah Berurah Hakashani, over here you can't ask an Eini Yehudi to do it. The refuah shalai hu linik ba'atzmai. The refuah is for the sick person to suckle the milk from the animal. What are you going to do? You're going to ask an Eini Yehudi to suckle the milk from the animal? The Yehudi is not going to get a refuah for what Tony does. So it doesn't work. Well, we got to go weiter in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber in the 3 lines up from the bottom, middle of the line. V'yesh ayimrim, there are those that say, Shem ein loy ela tsar shel ra'ov. Let's say the tsar that the individual is suffering over here is not tsar of goyneyach. It's not tsar that's being caused from an illness. It's hunger pangs. He's having tsar because he's hungry. Then also linoik me'am beheba b'Shabbos. There are those that say, look, we were just mater for the goyneyach to go ahead and suckle the milk from the animal and do mefarek d'Rabbanan from the animal. We were mater it because of tsar. Okay, now you have somebody who's b'tsar because he's having hunger pangs. So could he go ahead and do mefarek d'Rabbanan and suckle the milk from the animal? Says the Mechaber, yesh oimrim. There are those that say, and he brings this down from a Tosfos, there are those that say, Shem ein le'el tzar shel rav, if it's hunger pangs, also linoik me'am b'Shabbos. Then you're not allowed to do this on Shabbos. with the implication being that on Yom Tov it would be okay. Now, the first problem that the Mishnah Berurah is going to have here is V'yesh Imrim. In the beginning of Sif Lamed Gimel, did we discuss this question of suckling from an animal from hunger pangs? We didn't discuss it at all. Now, the opening shot of Sif Lamed Gimel, if you look at the Beragoyla Ois Katan Shin, that was something that was quoted from the Rif. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Rif doesn't discuss this shaila at all. So he doesn't know what the Yesh Oimrim over here. Yesh Oimrim is usually, we had one sheet one way, we have another sheet the other way. The beginning of Lamed Gimel did not discuss this shaila at all, and indeed the Rif doesn't discuss this shaila at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Kufches, V'yesh Oimrim. How Lashon Yesh Oimrim made him a duktuk? This is imprecise, this use of Yesh Oimrim. Damashba de Lusfar Rishayna Mutter b'Shabbos. The implication is, there's a Yesh Oimrim that says that it's also on Shabbos. Okay, so what? The first sheet holds it's Mutter on Shabbos. Afilu mishum tzarov, ube'emes lo yiskiru davar zaklal. The Rif didn't discuss this at all, and the Mechaber doesn't discuss it at all before he said Yesh Oimrim. So this Yesh Oimrim is a little bit imprecise. Sure, it's possible that according to the Rif, afilu b'yom tov also b'zeh. It could be that the Rif holds that to suckle from an animal to ease hunger pangs is also even on Yom Tov. Eladin b'ftei atzmahu. This Yesh Oimrim is a separate halacha. The Yesh paiskim shebechalkin be'Shabbos liyom tov li'inyan tzarav. You should know that there are those Rishonim that make a chilik when it comes to hunger pangs. And they say that to suckle from an animal to ease hunger pangs is mutter on Yom Tov, but it's also on Shabbos. And we'll see more about that in the next Mishnah Berurah. The Kosovo Bachvel Yerabad Halacha Kayesh Oimrim. Ois Katan Kuftes also Linoik the Dafka Bishop Tzar Choyli Yitiru. When in the beginning of Sif Lamed Gimel we were matir mefarik drabanon by suckling milk from an animal because of tsar, that was only because of the tsar of an illness. But we're not going to be matir mefarik through a shinui. So mefarik drabanon, we're not going to be matir that for hunger pangs. Hunger pangs are a lot less serious than an illness. So we'll be matir it for an illness, but we're not being matir it for hunger pangs. B'Shabbos kufyud aval b'yom tov mutter. But there are Rishonim that say that we treat Shabbos more chamor, more strictly than Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, we'll be matir the mefarik d'Rabbanan, even just for hunger pangs, but not on Shabbos. Im ein loy ein Yehudi lachlev al yadai, and this is only germane if you don't have an ein Yehudi to ask to go milk the animal for you. If it's possible for you to milk the milk from the animal directly onto a solid food, also linak befiv gam b'yom tov, then it would be also to suckle from the animal even on Yom Tov. El yaklav l'secha Michael k'moshe kasa sibitov kovhei. But the Chavetz Chaim is saying is like this. If you remember, we learned this earlier when we were learning the halachas of schita and the halachas of mefarek. We learned that to squeeze, let's say to take a peri and to squeeze the juice, to take a lemon and squeeze lemon juice directly onto a piece of fish, that is not considered mefarek. Why? Because we don't look at it that you extracted liquid from the fruit. Because at no point was the liquid chashuv by itself. You took the fruit, you squeezed out the lemon juice, and you put it directly onto the piece of salmon, and now you're going to eat it as part of the solid piece of salmon. So we don't look that you extracted a juice from a Michael. You didn't. It went directly from fruit to salmon. It never went to lemon juice. So to over here, if you could milk the animal directly onto a solid food, then it's not considered to be mefarik. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This was limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Hashem should send Yeshua Sephorus Panas and Shadduchim Tol as a need. We should be zeichet to see the B'Yeskel Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.